have been speaking of world order, but today we can move onto a new area of discussion. And I think we may take a look at something to do with the celestial sphere and the celestial clock, along the theme of signs and seasons. When we consider the religious traditions of the world, we quickly learn that most of their festivals are set according to astronomical events. These events may involve phases of the moon, they may involve equinoxes and solstices, in other words, cycles of the sun. And there is an understanding that the heavenly movements are a kind of celestial clock that can not only provide signs for us, but can also be the basis of our ritual observances in our faith traditions. In the book of Genesis, for example, in the first chapter, beginning at the 14th verse, it's talking about the fourth day of creation. And it mentions that the luminaries of the sun and the moon and the stars are given for signs and seasons. They're there to be a guide to time. Now, in the ancient world, the stars included both the fixed stars and also the wandering stars, because that's what planet means, coming from the Greek. So amongst the stars we have the planets that are visible to the naked eye, and they are the same planets that we see today. The planets that the ancients mentioned, the 7 planets, consist of the sun and the moon, and Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. Now the outer planets beyond Saturn, namely Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, in our solar system, can only be seen with telescopic magnification, and they were discovered from the 1780s onwards. Uranus in 1781, Neptune in the 1840s, and Pluto in 1930. So what they saw with the naked eye back in antiquity, and we can still see those planets today. Remember that when we were doing our segment on education and the quadrivium from classical antiquity, we had the trivium and the quadrivium, the group of 3 subjects, the group of 4 subjects, and in the quadrivium, which focused more on quantification and numeracy, we had arithmetic, geometry, musical harmony, and astronomy. So it was considered part of a general education to understand something about the movements of the heavenly bodies and their significance. Now, the system of cosmology that came down to us from the ancient world is associated with the name of Ptolemy, and it is a geocentric system. And in that system, the Earth is fixed at the centre. That's the frame of reference that's used. And the different bodies move around the Earth in different concentric shells, if you like, a bit like electrons orbiting an atom. And they move around in a certain order. And that order corresponds to the time it takes for a revolution. So the fastest revolvers are closer to the Earth, and the slowest revolvers are further away. So immediately moving out from the Earth, there is the Moon. And the Moon was considered to be the demarcation point between the purely physical or sublunary domain, the terrestrial domain, and then what lies beyond, which was a different zone of the universe, because the bodies in it were compounded not just of the elements on Earth, but contained the quintessence, a fifth element. After the Moon, we have Mercury, and then Venus orbiting outside of Mercury, and then the Sun. So, using the frame of reference with the Earth at the centre, the Sun takes about 365 and a quarter days to do a revolution. So it takes Venus less than that, 270 something days, Mercury less than that, maybe 88 days, and the Moon, of course, it goes around the Earth in under 28 days. There are two times associated with the Moon in terms of cycles. That orbital revolution, which is about 27 and a third days, and the lunation, that is the time from one phase to the next phase, like from new moon to new moon or from full moon to full moon, and that can be, well, that is roughly 29 and a half days. So if we just look at 28, that's an average number symbolising the cycle of the Moon. Beyond the Sun, of course, there's Mars, whose orbital revolution is longer than the solar year, and then Jupiter, which can take almost 12 years to do a round, to appear in the same place in the sky. So if you're born on a certain day, 12 years after that time, Jupiter is roughly in the same place as it was at that from that reference point, whether it's someone's birthday or some event that happened. Then you have Saturn, which is a slower moving planet, and it takes about 29.5 years to do an orbit. And people talk of a Saturn return and so on. That is the time between Saturn passing one point and its return after a full revolution. The interesting thing, well, there are a few interesting ratios amongst these orbital periods. The moon takes about the same number of days as Saturn takes years to go around. And if we go out from Saturn to Uranus, which can't be seen with the naked eye, remember, it goes around in 84 years. So for the ancients saw that as about the span of a human life, a good lengthed human life. And that 84 can break down into 3 lots of 28, similar to the orbital period of Saturn, 28 years. That's why Saturn came to symbolize, to be associated with phases of maturation, because you had about 3 Saturn returns in a human life. So the first return would be to do with the early part of life, the early stage of development, then the middle stage of development, and then the late stage, the twilight years. Again, if we start at Uranus's 84-year orbital period, you get 7 lots of 12 years being divisible into that. So if the Jupiterian cycle is about 12 years, you get about 7 cycles of the planet Jupiter in that symbolic lifespan of 84 years. It's not 70 years and 10, it's 70 years and 4. And we use the principle of Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, in this regard, in the sense that it's easier to understand something when we relate it to ourselves. It's easier to understand things about the vast cosmos when we relate it to the standard measurement of human beings. Not only their dimensions physically and their features like 10 fingers, but also the number of years that they live and so on. So we've got roughly 7 Jupiterian cycles in the 84-year Uranian cycle. And the number 7 gives us the 7 ages of man, which a number of people who have investigated this field think inspired Shakespeare to write in his play As You Like It. He put it into the mouth of Jacques, this speech about the 7 ages of man. There's a sense in which there's a planetary rulership for each of 7 stages of a human life. And it's not a far-fetched idea, because Shakespeare was writing at a time when Renaissance and Hermetic ideas, the revival of all these ideas from antiquity, along with the worldview that goes with them, had a lot of currency, and Shakespeare would have known about them as well. So in As You Like It, he says famously, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their entrances and their exits. That's right. You remember that?
Sure do.
And he says that each man in his time
plays many parts.
Plays 7 parts, in fact.
Is it 7? Oh, okay.
Whether he says many parts or... Then he enumerates 7 parts, or we can...
Hands, teeth, hands, eyes.
Oh, you're thinking of the last one where he's talking about the dotard, who's sans teeth, sans eyes. He's lost his teeth and so on. But the first part of the description is, first there is the infant mewling and puking in his nurse's arms.
I remember that.
Do you remember that one?
Absolutely.
Now, when you think of an infant and their dependence on adults and their need for nurturance, you have a set of ideas that are associated with the moon. Now, the moon, you remember, is in that first shell, closest to the earth. It's the first age. So it corresponds to the infant in the Shakespearean speech. Then he goes on to talk about the schoolboy, the whining schoolboy who goes off to school, with his satchel and his books. And this corresponds to Mercury. There's a lot of Mercury symbolism there because Mercury rules movement, commuting, but it also rules learning, education, intellect, communication. In the ancient world, Hermes, Mercury, the Greek name, the Latin name, was the god of crossroads, because when people came to a crossroads, they would converge with others coming from different directions, and they would often chat as they would in a forum or agora. So the crossroads promoted communication. It was also a messenger. So we've got mythology associated with the planets as well. They are personified too. Now, after the schoolboy in the As You Like It passage, the lover is mentioned. And love and romance under the rulership of Venus. So we find that Venus is the next planet out. And then he mentions the soldier, which is a reference to Mars, because the martial, Mars rules war. We get our words martial from martial, and the Greeks called this particular figure Ares, and the Romans called him Mars, and other nations gave different names. So after the soldier in the development of man, so he, an infant first, then he goes to school, then he falls in love, and then he becomes a soldier, goes to war. And then the portly judge, Jupiter. After the portly judge is the old man in his dotage, in lean and slippered pantaloon. He's wasting away. And this is Saturn, Father Time, who rules old things, aging, maturation. And after that we get the second childhood, so which is a sort of return to the beginning. So if you like, the sun and the moon, the sun sort of pops out there and is somehow brought together with the moon to mark a second childhood. So the ages of man may well be based on this ancient cosmology and the sequence of the planets. And the planets are noteworthy in other ways as well. They give us the names of the days of the week, and they move in a certain order. Ancient Babylon, ancient Israel had a sequence, and it has come down to us today in the names of the days of the week, because Sunday is said to correspond to or is ruled by the sun. Then Monday is really the moon day. When you look at the French lundi, you've got the root for the word luna in there, L-U-N. And then Tuesday, mardi, Mars's day. M-A-R-D-I is the word for Tuesday in French. And then, mercredi. Wednesday is Mercury's day. Now, Thursday seems to be influenced by Norse mythology, where they had a different set of gods, like Thor. So Thursday became Thor's day. And Friday was related to the goddess Freya, a counterpart of Venus. So Venus rules Friday, and then Saturday is Saturn's day. So we have the 7 planets. I'm including the sun and the moon as planets just for ease of reference. The 7 planets represented in the 7 days of the week. And in the ancient menorah, the candlestick of ancient Israel, it's a 7-pronged candlestick. And these heavenly lights in the firmament are symbolized by the prongs of the candlestick. Now if you go around the world, you'll see that the different cultures using the planets in different ways. The Babylonians, and also the Hebrews, I believe, not only had planets ruling over a day, but every hour of a 24-hour day had a planetary ruler. And there was a certain sequence to the rulership of the hours. And that sequence wasn't the same sequence as the days of the week, where we get sun, moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus and Saturn. It was a different sequence. It was, in fact, it went Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. And this sequence is traced on the tree of life as well as the sequences of the Sephiroth and the pathway of the flaming sword, as they call it. And if you think about it, it all ties in with the ancient Ptolemaic geocentric system, because that sequence, the sequence of the rulers of the hours, follows the order of the planets in the Ptolemaic universe. Saturn outermost, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. And when you go across to India, you will see that in their spiritual tradition, yoga was like the advanced calculus within Hinduism. So the serious spiritual seekers would practice yoga, and they would have to learn about energy centers in the subtle body called chakras or wheels. And again, the planets were associated with these energy centers. The sun and the moon together here, in a kind of conjunction, like the first and second childhood in As You Like It. And then at the throat, Mercury, the ruler of communication, the voice box. Now, we're going to see that each planet has a positive and a negative, and I don't mean negative in the sense of bad, but a receptive as against an active aspect, and therefore it's associated with two signs of the zodiac. For example, Mercury, in its active aspect or masculine aspect, is associated with the sign of Gemini. It's said to rule Gemini, and I'll explain what that means. It means essentially that the influence of this planet, the expression of the principle that is this planet, works well and straightforwardly in the sign of Gemini. Now, on the passive side of Mercury, you've got its rulership of Virgo. Virgo is considered a feminine sign. Gemini is considered a masculine sign. And so, in yoga, the Mercury with the throat chakra, and then at the heart, Venus, love. Venus also has an active and a receptive side to its rulership. The active side is ruler of Libra, the passive side of Taurus, the bull. These energy centers were considered to underlie major nerve plexuses in the body. And when you have a nerve plexus or a nervous system, you've got afferent and efferent fibers. In other words, nerves that carry impulses from the periphery to the central nervous system, and nerves that carry impulses from the central nervous system to the periphery. Sensory motor. And the yogis were grappling with these currents. Let's complete the list. We go down from the heart center to the solar plexus center, the seat of ambition and aggression, Mars. And Mars is, in its positive aspect, rules Aries. In its negative aspect, Scorpio. Then we go down to the sex center, the center of generation and enlargement and expansion, Jupiter. In its positive aspect, it rules Sagittarius. In its negative or feminine receptive aspect, it rules Pisces. And then the root or base chakra at the base of the spine, Saturn, which gives us our sense of grounding and stability and connection to the material world and all the imperatives of survival therein. And in its positive aspect, Aquarius, and in its negative aspect, Capricorn. Pain is part of the rulership of Saturn. And when we say rulership, we're using we're saying that there seems to be a symbolic correspondence between this planet and these other items or processes. There's a pattern involved that people who study these things are able to delineate. Now, the outer planets, the modern planets, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, also have a rulership. They have an overlapping rulership. So Uranus will rule Aquarius as well. And Neptune will rule Pisces as well. And Pluto will rule Scorpio as well. And maybe those three could be associated with crown. Now, I've brought in the zodiac signs here because the ancients could see that the planets followed a path through the sky. They were always moving against a background of stars. And that path through the sky was considered to be a circle of animals to the Greeks. A kuklos. A zodiac is kind of like a circular zoo of different animal figures, which were the patterns that they recognized in the constellations. So all of those 7 bodies moved against these relatively fixed stars, the circle of the zodiac. And if you think of the planets as principles, then these principles would express themselves differently as they move through these different signs. There's a difference between a constellation and a sign. The Vedic astrology, called Jyotish, that comes from ancient India, focuses more on the constellations. It's sidereal, to do with stars. And the Western approach focuses more on the mathematized 30-degree division of the circle, pinned to the tropics. So you've got 4 cardinal points in the year, 2 equinoxes, 2 solstices, and there's your framework. And you can divide that circle up further by putting in 3 divisions within each season, and you end up with 12 30-degree divisions of the circle of the zodiac, and we call those divisions signs. Now, when a planet is in a certain sign, it might express its principle powerfully, straightforwardly, in dignity, as it were. When it's in an opposite sign, that principle may struggle to be expressed. It may be somewhat muted. In other words, it could be detrimentally expressed in that sign. Sometimes the planetary power or principle is exalted, and sometimes it falls badly. So the signs, the zodiacal signs, determine how this principle of being, and we're dealing with a whole set of symbols here. The sign determines how that principle of being is being expressed. Now, where this expression has taken place has to do with the armature of the sky. What do I mean by that? I mean the line of the horizon and of the mid-heaven. For the ancients, there was a dome, a sky dome, a firmament. And everything would rise over the eastern horizon. And it would set in the west. Those 2 points were called ascendant and descendant. All of these bodies in tracking over the imaginary sky dome against the fixed stars of the zodiac would culminate above head. Our concept of noon is something culminating directly above us, and that's called the mid-heaven. And the opposite point on the other side of the earth is called the nadir. And so these reference points, along with intermediate ones, on the sky dome armature of the sky, where the horizon is very important, and so too the overhead position. They express where this pattern of energy is manifesting. So we've got the what in the planets, the how in the signs, and the where in what are called the houses of the sky armature. And therein lie the elements of astrology. We'll leave it at that for our first transmission.